There we go.
It is working. Deb Kerr from Australian Pork Limited. My question's to Robert. You mentioned African swine fever and probably left it as a full stop there. Media reports that Germany and France and possibly even the United States will probably have some incursions of this disease in the next 1 to 2 years. I'm just wondering what your projections are for pork trade internationally if those big producers were to fall with African swine fever.
You know, it's tough to do projections of what, you know, a potential outbreak, you know, a larger outbreak in Asia or even in Europe may entail. And certainly folks at USDA as well as Canada and Mexico are working pretty closely to make sure that we can keep an outbreak out of North America. Certainly, and that was a part of what we talked about at our Outlook Forum 2 weeks ago. And so, you know, I guess we're hoping and working as hard as we can to prevent any continued spread of ASF into the United States and amongst, just like we do for any very impactful disease. So we haven't modeled sort of what-if scenarios in that case. Certainly we know from the outbreak of high-path avian influenza a couple years ago that these diseases can have a pretty devastating effect on markets, production, farm income, and so it's not like we're being Pollyannish about it. We certainly know it's a factor. It's just very difficult to model it. Certainly we can see just looking at futures prices that the markets did factor in some pretty heavy perspectives on risk, and we've seen analysis done by a variety of groups, perhaps some in this room, on what might happen if ASF spreads further to some of the more commercial herds in China. And certainly, if that happens, and I think most people acknowledge that the transportation within China is certainly affecting the ability of Chinese domestic supply to meet Chinese domestic demand. And so, again, I don't have any projections on what this could mean, but certainly we know from experience that oftentimes diseases can be, the risk of them sometimes is overblown, but on the other hand, we've seen cases where it's overtaken the domestic situation, particularly just thinking about HPAI. It was the largest disease outbreak we had in the United States and affected a huge amount of the poultry sector in the U.S., and we're still trying to recapture some of that market share.
Thank you. Just a gentleman in the middle.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Dan Cerna with the Hancock Natural Resource Group. This question is for the entire panel, but be curious on your thoughts about the horticultural, the fruit and tree nut space. Given potentially slower global growth, do you see that sector being more sensitive to that deceleration in growth? And also, how do you view the rate of change of that sector relative to the row crops and livestock sectors? Thank you.
Okay. Well, you know, when I present the numbers of the 10 years outlook for Argentina, I mentioned that I was using what we call the baseline scenario. That means that the current policies and the current trends are the same for the next 10 years. So it is our result consider this new economic outlook that it's not that optimistic. And that's why we think that our sector in Argentina, that we are, export for us are very important. It's going to be difficult years that we have ahead. We are expecting to increase our production levels, and we know that our domestic demand will increase, but at lower rates. We are just 40 million persons in Argentina, and our domestic consumption could increase, but not too much. And we are confident that we have to export more. So I think that if export and global GDP start to grow, but at a lower rate, it's going to be more difficult to do that. I think that countries like ours have to work a lot in promote free trade and to promote new trade agreement in order to give access to this new level of production. That's all I can say.
Certainly in the U.S., the impact of the retaliatory tariffs is affecting our horticulture sector significantly. That being said, we're expecting to see higher levels of exports in that sector in 2019 relative to 2018. So even though we have lost some of the Chinese market, we are managing to find new places to sell that produce. I think the USMCA agreement will also provide a positive impetus once we get that implemented as well. So I would say that it has been a fast-growing sector in the United States, and I would, relative to the more traditional row crop and livestock sectors, and I would expect it to continue to be so.
I think that's the same here. That's what we've seen in the recent past. Part of that's because of our relatively stable water property right regime. We've seen people shift to Australia to expand horticulture production. So your question was also to how vulnerable are those sectors to changes in economic growth elsewhere, and I suppose that depends on the particular product you're talking about. Some of them are very high-end products that get very high unit values, so you would expect that they would be quite susceptible to changes in per capita incomes. So if there were a growth slowdown, some of those would be affected quite significantly, others not so much. The other thing to keep in the back of your mind is, some of the prices we've seen recently have been high because of poor conditions elsewhere in the world, and that's changing. So, some of the good prices will be coming down as production ramps up elsewhere. And the same way that we've seen people put money into, things like almonds here, that's same incentive applies elsewhere. So you can expect same sort of competition in horticulture as we're seeing, and sort of Ramiro and Rob have outlined for broadacre cropping and livestock.
Thank you. And we've got time for just one more question over here.
Thank you. Tony York, farmer from WA Farmers, a grain grower. Just a question for Robert. Corn and biofuels and ethanol in North America, US, it's quite a significant amount of the corn is, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Quite a significant amount of corn is involved in ethanol production, and some of us worry about whether that ratio is going to change in the future with different energy policies or whatever in the US. Can you give us any indication of how important it is in terms of the corn output, and whether you see any risks in terms of the biofuel consumption from corn?
Yeah, no, great question. I would say that, let's put it this way. If you had asked me this question last year, I would have said that the biofuel situation in the United States was relatively mature, and we weren't seeing that many changes going forward. We have seen a lot of developments in the United States with respect to our biofuels policy, meaning that every year there's rulemaking. We go through a process by which we set the new volumetric obligations, and that for corn and ethanol isn't going to really change that much. I guess the big shift is how the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States implements the program. That has had some recent implications for the use of corn and ethanol. That being said, the administration is also committed to moving forward with sort of more pro-ethanol policies, rulemakings in terms of blending higher levels of ethanol into gasoline supply. So on the one hand, you've got these positive forces pushing up the potential to use ethanol in the United States motor fuel supply. On the other hand, you have increasing efficiency standards for automobiles pushing down the actually consumption of gasoline in the United States. And certainly if you talk to the ethanol stakeholders in the United States, they're looking at export markets for a large part of their growth, whether that's to Mexico or to Brazil or actually to China. Certainly we sell a lot of ethanol to Canada as well. But in terms of just relative use, we use quite a bit of corn in the ethanol refining sector, but then we get back a lot of DDGs in return. So the net effect, I think, is somewhere around 30% of the corn crop once you account for the DDGs coming back into the feed supply are used by the refining sector in the United States.
Thank you very much. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your questions. Please join me in thanking our panel for this great discussion. Peter Goudet, Robert Johansson, and Ramiro Costa. Thank you very much.